Pleasure to be chairing the session where we have a talk by Professor Naman AHUJA on early cosmopolitan engagements in the Deccan. Naman AHUJA needs no detailed introduction. I know that you're all familiar with his work, especially his important contribution to the study of early Indian terracottas and his many writings on early Indian art. And apart from that, we of course also know him for the wonderful exhibition that he curated recently in the National Museum on the body in Indian art. So I would request Naman to come and deliver his lecture.
Thank you all very much for being here. It's nice to have so many people interested in this subject, but I particularly wish to thank Renu and Kavita and Preeti for the fantastic work that you've all put into making this project happen and come together so fantastically. I'm going to take off somewhere from a little clue that Navina left us, a Roman ring with a Golconda diamond. And I'm going to try and move backwards to that time, to a different period of cosmopolitanism, a period in which different kinds of things circulated, and amongst a very different kind of people. Things which are more quotidian, everyday, secular, if you want to call them, things that belonged to people. All of us who've studied the monuments of ancient India have been enthralled by the great works of Gummadi-Duru, Bhattiprolu, Anupu, monuments galore that sort of dot the entire landscape of Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, Karnataka, portions of Maharashtra. But who are these people? These people that we see so artfully composed on the more famous monuments that you might be more familiar with, Amaravati, or as in this case, Nagarjunakonda. In their artful dalliance, as the way these ladies look at us and they lean on these gentlemen, each sporting different clothes, a different hairstyle, a different mood in their romance, in their languor. These pieces date from the 3rd century AD. And I'm just looking at one of thousands of lintels that survive from these monuments all over. And I'm just looking at only the Mithun sculptures that punctuate what we started off looking at, which was that long lintel on which there was scenes from the Bodhisattva's life, from the Buddha's biography, interspersed with these Mithun couples. Who are these Mithun couples? And what is the nature of the artistic training that is imparting such reserve and poise and control in the way in which they are sculpted? Let us remind ourselves of why Amaravati is considered such a great epoch of world art. Looking at this particular roundel in the Chennai Museum carefully, one will see something which is unparalleled in the history of world art. A tondo, for those of you who are art students, here we have a tondo which has a diagonal composition within it. There is a very clear, a neat triangular composition. And what is in that triangular composition? The circle has been arranged, a flat horizontal, another break of line there, another break of line there. And as our eye leads up to it in this continuous narrative, you see a raging elephant coming forward, whose wrath is such that he carries a body, a corpse, in his trunk, as a man hangs, whose arm breaks out of the margin, taking us, the viewer, into his composition, to look deeper into it as we go in to see where do we lead. And we lead not to the front, but to the back of a man, in the heart of the composition. The triangle leads up to see this man in reverse. And what is it that the man is looking at? But nothing but abject fear, the terror that is personified as this woman leans into this man to rescue her from this maddened elephant. And there come the Buddhist monks from the side, quelling the rage of that elephant. What kind of world knows about compositional strategies like this as early as the 3rd century? That's played with every trick in the book. In fact, it's writing the book. This hasn't happened before in the history of world art, with quite as much sophistication and understanding of artistic prowess and sophistication. Where does this strength of understanding of the body, of composition, come from? On a recent trip into Andhra Pradesh, I was staggered by the finds at Panigiri, a site that has not yet received the kind of scholarly attention it warrants. There are few places in that region that have sculptures that can quite compare with things of this quality. Broken torsos, broken fragments lie in the local site museum. And as we go closer into examining them, their details astound one. The grace with which the hand holds onto the belt, the sophistication with which those tassels are wrapped, and each one with a ribbon and a festoon around the tassel, keeping it in place. In the Hyderabad Museum, there is this depiction, which comes from the story of how Siddhartha gave up his turban, how the Bodhisattva's turban became an important relic. On the relief, you will see that there is a man who is carrying a large tray on which there is the turban of the Bodhisattva. It's a scene we are familiar with in terms of composition from the Deccan. We've seen it at Nagarjunakonda as well. But the Panigiri artist does something unparalleled. He makes the whole relief into a turban. The whole sculpture outline is the turban itself, as its folds come in, and there is the medallion in the center, exactly like the turban that you see there. In the central part of the relief, the prince is seated, monks gather on one side, other princes gather on the other, and there is a man who turns his back, shielding his face, unable to witness the fact that he's going to sacrifice his life as a temporal ruler. In the reliefs at Amaravati, we must remember we have seen scenes of such sophistication. Women dancing in the court of the Nagas, a transverse flute. In Kushan sculpture all over North India, in Greek sculpture, we'd only seen straight flutes, transverse flutes, a figure playing an instrument. We see her from the back. She holds on to the instrument, and it's a fretted instrument. She's strumming on the strings. She's pressing the frets with her fingers, as will be seen in many other instruments from the Deccan at this time, many other depictions from the same sorts of monuments. From the Vesantara Jatak, the king sits on a throne. Note the shape of the throne. It's got legs, which are very typically Indian. Look at the arms of the throne, however, and you'll see that it is supported by yalis. We were just looking in the last lecture at the fantastic yalis or vyala images. But these are about 1,000 years or 1,200 years earlier, from the same part of the world. From Amaravati as well, but a slightly different kind of throne for the Buddha. This one, with a rounded back, cushions propped up there with lion's paws, the same kind of footstool that we're so familiar with from the Kushan period. But that shape of chair, with its winged arms, now that's a kind of chair and a piece of furniture that we haven't seen so much of in India. And where is this kind of furniture design coming into Amaravati from? Staying in the same region, going towards Vijayawada, we come across the site of Goli. Now, much of the fabulous sculptures of Goli were removed from the site and taken to the Chennai Museum, and unfortunately haven't been put on public display for many, many years, although the promise has been held out for an equal number of years that we're going to see the sculptures finally. But in the meantime, these are old black and whites taken of those sculptures. And in the middle of all of this scene, again from the Bodhisattva's life, different episodes, there stands a couple. And as we look at that couple, in a little more detail, you'll see that she's not even Indian. She's clearly in Roman costume, holding onto a stemmed goblet with a handle, offering it to a man who holds a spear in his hand. Who are these people in Goli? Now, just to set the stage and move a little backward, what's going on in the world at this time, this period that I'm looking at? All of you would remember Mark Antony has famously moved in with Cleopatra. And that is the period of the world that we are looking at. That is the period that we are situating ourselves squarely in. The Ptolemies of Egypt are under Roman influence. Greece itself has been laid captive and is being Latinized. The Roman Empire borders the Parthian Empire, which was built on the base of the Seleucid Empire. Portions of West Asia and the Near East have just come under Parthian influence. And the Parthians like to be called Philhellenic, friends of the Greeks, offering a safe haven to the fleeing Greeks. Egypt, at this time, has declared itself as a friendly zone that is open to giving domicile to the Greeks. So they don't have the same right of citizenship, but they can live freely as free citizens in Egypt. The harnessing of the monsoon winds has reduced the maritime voyage time between Alexandria and Barigaza, Muziris, Arikamedu, Tamralipta, and beyond. And these trade networks are now competing with the old trade network of the so-called Silk Route that was there across, that traded with the Near East by going overland. And now there are these maritime networks which are competing with that trade. And meanwhile, if all of this is happening in Central Asia and in Egypt and the Near East, what's going on in India at this time? Well, India sees the coming of many diasporic Greeks, Scythians or Shakas as we call them, who affect the art of the northern parts of the subcontinent, even as we contend with the rise of various local kingdoms of different religious and cultic affiliations. The Mauryas, for instance, famously adopted one heterodox religion after another. The Shungas, the Mitras, the Yaudehas, Audambaras, Satvahanas, Kshatrapas, Indo-Greeks, the Kushans. I mean, we've got a surfeit of kingdoms that are around in the subcontinent, each one with a different cultic affiliation, or at least a slightly different subsect of a religion that they seem to be patronizing. The world that we are looking at this time is certainly one which has been connected by great empires. Conquests take place. A Hellenistic world is created. The big swath of blue that you see, of the blue-gray, is the great Seleucid Empire left in the aftermath of Alexander, which borders the lands of India, Afghanistan over there, and carries on all the way through to Greece itself. So now we've got a uniting political authority, which is maybe short-lived, but Greek certainly becomes the lingua franca of trade across this region. Now, I'm going to focus, looking at the modern map that was released about 6-7 months ago by the Maps of India company, at this area. This is what we are concerned with. And these are the current political boundaries that we are looking at. And most of the sites I'm going to look at come from this region, right in the middle. Now, these are older maps, not necessarily the most accurate, but they give you an idea about what is happening in India at the period that I'm talking about. Like I said, again, an old map that lists the various major sites in the region that I'm looking at, but this is not a complete list. So there's a huge amount of archaeological evidence. And what does that evidence have? Lying hidden in the middle of the sculptures at Nagarjunakonda, a pair of double-humped dromedaries. Who are they? Where did they reach the eastern coast of Andhra from? Clearly, they're brought in by Central Asians. And where are these Central Asians? On the grand pillars of Nagarjunakonda, in the middle of them, suddenly there's a pair of Scythians wearing their typical hats, their churidars, shirts with a clear ruff on the collar, and with small goatees, both of them. If you go to Maharashtra, in the Kolhapur Museum, a famous hoard which was found of bronze artifacts from a place called Brahmagiri was found filled with various objects that came from the Alexandrian trade. They contained objects which were symptomatic and archaeologists looked at as glaring examples of the nature of India's exchange that was going on at the time of about the 1st to 2nd century AD with the Roman world. But we need to understand what we mean by the Roman world. What does Rome actually imply? Hadrian's Wall, or Romania, the province of Dacia, coming down to Alexandria? The Roman world is actually an enormous part of the universe at that time. So this could be from anywhere in the Roman world. And increasingly, we've been working as a consortium of scholars at trying to understand how images moved and what were the sources of visual culture that moved between parts of the world during these great epochs. And what were the kinds of objects that were actually traveling from place to place. Now, small portable things like this didn't just carry objects of fancy and curiosity, but these are actually great objects that carry iconographic systems along with it, that impact other regions and other people who look at those myths. They were obviously of tremendous value. Otherwise, somebody wouldn't have taken the care to bury them so carefully. In the same hoard, lying in the Kolhapur Museum, is this ewer. Now, we found other scattered bits of ewers, handles, for instance. Now, both these handles, one more denuded than the other one, clearly show putti or amorini on them. The most startling one, of course, was this image of Poseidon. Now, lest you think that the trade is all happening one way, many history books have illustrated this grand sculpture. Tiny little thing it is. Call it a grand sculpture because of the kind of civilizational impact it has. An ivory statuette of a Yakshini was discovered out of the ashes of Vesuvius. It was found in Pompeii. It's been lying in the museum in Naples. Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD. Obviously, this Indian Yakshini had made its way to Pompeii before 79 AD. Now, it's usually been illustrated only from the front. It's very nice to be able to see the picture with the mirror showing the back of this sculpture, where you can see clearly the way in which the hair is braided is what we typically associate with Mauryan period hairstyle in the terracottas. These looped long braids. It's absolutely diagnostic of late Mauryan workmanship, but it carries on into the post-Mauryan period, which is the period which we associate with the making of this particular statuette. Ivory carving makes one think about the other ivories, the very famous Begram ivories that were found in Afghanistan, where in the strong room they discovered an entire series of ivory artifacts which seem to belong to pieces of furniture. These have tantalized scholars for over 50 years now, and people have been trying to attribute a provenance for them. They're clearly not made in Afghanistan. They're certainly made in India. People used to wonder that these sculptures, that these carvings might have been made somewhere near Vidisha. After all, it was the ivory carvers of Vidisha who left an inscription on the monument of Sanchi to say that they were responsible for those carvings. So it could be possible that central India may be the source. Torans like this are very famous in central India. But there is another group of scholars who have contended that a careful examination of these images reveals that they are actually more probably made in the Deccan rather than being made in Sanchi. The specific details of the attire of the ladies, the mood that they are invested with, the way in which architectural detail has been carved, the presence of the arms of the throne, which is clearly in the shape of the Vyala or the Yali, which is going to come up in so much for the whole history of Indian art, is going to be found as an element of furniture for centuries more. But most particularly, it was this, more specifically, it was this fragment that clearly revealed figures that come out of an Amaravati, Nagarjunakonda kind of style. The languid nature of the body, the kind of ease that they are invested with, the very smooth, almost liquid line. But if you look at it more, although the ladies may seem to come out of some precursor to a Nayaka Bhed, with the woman sitting with a parrot, an empty bird cage, they're sitting inside a frame of a Greek key fret. And that Greek key fret is within a scroll which is undoubtedly of Roman origin. And that sits within a final border, which is undisputedly a very typical bead and reel. So we have over here the clear markers of all the stylistic constituents that would go into making a very sophisticated cosmopolitan world. An object that's been found in Afghanistan that has figures in the center of it which look like they've been made in the Deccan, which has influences around it which are both Greek and Roman. If ivories were the kind of objects that might have been used at one end of the social spectrum, there are other objects made of more simple, more humble material like clay. Now, these clay artifacts we've found are molded artifacts, most of them, which means that they are mass-produced. Now, if you go into any flea market in the Western world, from North Africa up into Scotland, you'll find that there are antique dealers, petty antique dealers, who are always trying to flog Roman lamps. And they don't cost very much money at all. And there are thousands and thousands of them available. It's in the same way, we have a basic shape which is similar, but the designs on them are completely different, which are the Satvahana lamps made at the same time, which have been found in Paithan, at Ter, in Kondapur, and in many other sites in the Deccan. From the same sites have also been found a series of imitation Roman coins. And curiously enough, they imitate coins of Nero sometimes. Nero, whose coins were almost all melted down and aren't found because he became persona non grata in the Roman Empire, curiously, his coins were being treated as bullion with the Indian world, and imitations of Nero's coins were turned into talismans, perhaps to be given as counters, as some kind of votive offering, where instead of giving gold coins, people gave terracotta pratinidhis, or substitutes. It was believed that they might have been used as talismans for people to wear. Well, terracotta makes for rather fragile jewelry, unless that jewelry is being used ceremonially. So it could be, again, that for special ceremonial purposes, for those who couldn't afford wearing strings of real Roman gold coins, would use terracotta Roman coins, terracotta imitation Roman coins, for that particular ceremony where they were meant to be dressed in that particular iconography of that kind of jewelry. And then that becomes the kind of thing that becomes discarded. And that becomes the kind of thing that survives the accident of discovery that archaeologists base their careers on. Now, not everything clearly has this kind of Roman influence in the Deccan. There are other talismans and molds for jewelry made at the same sites in the same period that clearly show Indian deities. Gajalakshmi is a figure who is being abducted by a giant yaksha, another lady there who looks like she comes clearly out of the world of Shunga terracottas, another early Lakshmi figure. What are the other major kinds of iconography that we know from the Deccan, which are unique and spectacular? The Badami Museum's famous example of the so-called Lajja Gauri, for instance, a sculpture that every student of Indian art has seen and studied at some point. This remarkable woman giving birth, whose consciousness is that of a lotus, in whose hands are lotuses as serpents crawl over her body. Fertility symbols abound. Now, those who have studied the iconography of this particular image know that the sculpture wasn't really made any time after the 8th century. The iconography seems to have vanished from the Indian consciousness. But there are many sculptures of her which go back to an earlier period. This particular piece is inscribed with the words Mahadevi, and it lies in the Nagarjunakonda Museum. And it shows a very different kind of influence and a very different kind of practice that might have been around in that world of Nagarjunakonda, where, along with the Buddhists, there were other cults that were active in that region as well. This sculpture is monumental. It's about 2.5 feet, 3 feet wide. But most commonly, you get these little things. 1.5 to 2 inches large, sometimes a little bit larger. Same iconography, little things made in clay. Are these votive offerings? The plaque at the right, on the far side, is made out of stone. Now, the startling thing is that if you look into the domestic, what happens, the great problem that archaeologists and art historians have, or rather mistake that we've been making, is that we always seem to compare great Indian art with great Greek art or great Roman art. But when you start studying everyday Roman and Greek terracottas and everyday Indian terracottas, you see a completely different level of connections and exchange. So here we have a figure, the iconography of which has been termed baobo. And again, we've got scores of these that have been found in Egyptian sites. And they're all dated at the same date as the rise of the Lajja Gauri image in India. And they are all shown in the same pose of a woman shown birthing. There are other connections too. We've been astounded with a particular kind of terracotta manufacturing that happens in Paithan and Ter particularly, which show double molded figures. So you have two molds, the front and back of a sculpture, which are pressed together to be able to reveal a hollow terracotta image, which has been pressed out of two molds simultaneously. Now, these double molded objects were then dipped into a kaolin slip. So they were engobed in a white colored slip and then fired. Now, that's exactly the kind of manufacturing that we get in Alexandria for how they made terracottas at the same time. Not only is the technology similar, but we've been struck by a group of figures which we always thought was some kind of Indian child deity with its arms raised. Lots of these little boys. Clearly, they must have been made for putting up as offerings to some shrine. Was it a shrine of Kumar, Kartikeya perhaps, where these might have been put up as offerings? We don't know. But the curious thing is that we've found terracottas with exactly the same gesture. That's from Nagarjunakonda, and that comes from Egypt. And they're both the same date. In the body exhibition recently, I borrowed this object from Guntur. It shows an early depiction of one of these so-called haritis, goddesses who could claim children's lives as much as they could protect children's lives. Very little is known about the goddess Hariti, except in Buddhist sources. Yet, there are widespread beliefs about goddesses who are worshipped as some kind of a prophylactic against smallpox or chickenpox. Most Indian languages, the word for chickenpox is Mata or Mariamman in southern India. This link of the mother as the one who can both afflict as well as cure is so widespread and yet is not documented in Sanskrit sources. It doesn't form a part of mainstream religion. It exists at the level of folklore, of popular practice, and evidence for its antiquity goes back into these kinds of small images. This stone sculpture is only about 12 inches high, and the little terracottas I've been looking at of those little babies, which look like the baby in her lap, I'm sorry the slide is a little bleached, have exactly the same iconography, are found mostly in terracotta. Now, an example from Bengal shows a similar goddess with a baby in her lap, and she sits on a stool which has the same pot-bellied yaksha figures at the base on which she sits. There are very clear ways in which these objects are moving between civilizations. From the Nile Delta, from the port of Memphis, were discovered a series of terracottas which clearly show Indian influence. Roman historians have tried to doubt this Indian influence, but for those of you who are familiar with Indian iconography can probably see that although the wings on this figure and the facial style might look a little bit unusual, the Channavira, the crossband jewelry that is worn, and the fact that the boy or hermaphrodite rises out of a lotus is so clearly coming out of Indian imagery. So there's a whole body of these which lie in the Petrie Museum in the which is attached with the Institute of Archaeology in London. Chandraketugad, Paithan, and Ter have revealed a whole group of ladies who have holding a baby at their waist on their hip, and the baby usually has that gesture that painting historians of later times tend to call the gesture of wonderment, but actually has a much older history linking with the god Harpokrates, who is always shown with the finger at his lips. And there are many examples of exactly the same thing, the mother with the baby at the hip, with the boy holding his finger up, clearly Harpokrates. It's the iconographic cognizant of the deity Harpokrates. That's Egyptian, that's Indian, exactly the same period. Now, Harpokrates is one of those elements, iconographic things that can be studied, and I'd urge students again to run away with this. Harpokrates is one of those deities that becomes global in the Roman period. We found Harpokrates from, like I said, from Hadrian's Wall to Afghanistan to eastern Andhra Pradesh. And it's interesting to see how prolific this deity becomes at this time. Now let's migrate to a slightly different part of the world with which Amaravati and Nagarjunakonda have no small amount of contact. And that's, let's move on the other part of the trading route. Let's come down the coast to Sri Lanka. Now, in the excavations at Maritime in northern Sri Lanka, which I haven't brought slides of today, because all my old slides of Maritime are all old 35 millimeter slides that we haven't yet digitized. But there are a lot of artifacts that are found in Maritime which clearly look like they're manufactured in Chandraketugad. They're manufactured on ports of the Bay of Bengal, but traded down the coast to Sri Lanka. It's not just little terracottas that are moving down to Sri Lanka at this time. It's massive stone monuments. Although the design of the Sri Lankan stupas seems to be distinct and unique to Sri Lanka, a lot of the limestone that is used for the sculptures in Sri Lanka isn't quarried in Sri Lanka at all, but is actually transported from Andhra Pradesh to Sri Lanka in about the 1st century BC. And these extraordinary monuments, therefore, invent their iconographies afresh, or reinvent them rather, adapt them to their local needs. And that's the interesting thing, is to see how the adaptation takes place. So we've never actually found a stupa that looks quite like this. But the idea that stupas would have had freestanding pillars, especially 5 freestanding pillars at the entrance, became a common formula in the stupas of the Deccan. But here, the Vedika and the pillar is turned into something completely unique, with a series of these concentric circles of pillars around the stupa. Zooming in and looking at the entrance to some of these stupas, and especially this one, the Kantaka stupa, or Kantaka Chaitya, if we look at the carving, now you can see that it's got a brick core, a stone cladding, all that is typical. The idea that there are elephants at the base, yeah, that becomes a standard feature. It's going to be picked up in later Indian architecture. But seeing these elements carved on the railing. Now, the Kantaka Chaitya is important because it has perhaps the earliest Brahmi inscriptions on a stupa in Sri Lanka. And it is because it is in Medigiriya, it is associated with Mahinda as one of the earliest Buddhist settlements in Sri Lanka. And in the middle of it all, there is a local adaptation of the acanthus leaf motif, which we are so familiar with Mauryan and post-Mauryan art. It's not exactly the same. It's not as carefully carved as it would be in Amaravati, certainly not as carefully carved as it is at Bodh Gaya or on the Ashokan pillar abaci, but it is an adaptation of that same motif. The lion capital on pillars, again, very typical. We've seen it at Amaravati. The motifs on the stair risers, again, the yakshas, the yalis, the swans, the lions, the winged creatures, as they progress upward, as you climb up the steps. Again, we are familiar with those motifs. We've seen them, but we haven't quite seen them being used as well. There are similarities in the quality of the relief carving. They're clear borrowing of the styles, but the amalgamation and the way they are put together is entirely unique in Sri Lanka. At Mehintale, this particular relief, which shows an elephant with human arms being worshipped by a series of ganas, makes one wonder whether we can give him the title Gana Isha. And if he is the Isha of the ganas, is this really the earliest depiction of Ganesha in South Asia at this early period? And if he is that, what's he doing on a Buddhist stupa? Now, the interesting thing is this is not the only place where there would be Hindu, quote-unquote, Hindu images on Buddhist stupas. After all, Bodh Gaya itself has the famous Surya. Sanchi is adorned with a series of Sri Lakshmis and Gajalakshmis. The truth is, we know remarkably little. What we have are actually, as I said earlier, the accidents of discovery. In Andhra Pradesh, there have been other major finds. The famous Gudimallam Linga, overshadowed by the more famous temple next to it of Tirupati, gets few pilgrims. But that it was an important site up until the 10th century is attested to by the early Chola reconstruction of this particular shrine. Satvahana coins were found in the excavations by I.K. Sharma when he dug into that Vedika area. So obviously that lingam was in worship during the Satvahana period. Its carving has the same kind of flat two-dimensional relief quality that we get with early Bharut. Could it be as early as the 2nd century BC? This forgotten and broken fragment that I've been trying to work on for the past 10 years more has been lying in the basement of the British Museum. It's only ever been published once or twice in academic journals. I discovered that there's an inscription on top of it. It comes from a Vedika. That's a drawing of the side. You can clearly see it's got the same lenticular motices which would have come around a Vedika. And it has the lady with the ayudhas in her hairdo, weapons, projectiles, that are so familiar to us from Chandraketugarh terracottas, that we so clearly assume as being the figures of an iconographic system that we've yet not been able to decode. We yet don't know who they are, but again, present in a Buddhist context. There are other small discoveries. We know that this was a period with the rise of what we call Bhagavatism, a particular precursor to Vaishnav worship in India. And amongst the things that are discovered in Guntur has been this remarkable carving, which shows an early depiction of Narasimha surrounded by the Panchaviras who become the Bhagavad heroes. I'm going to end with a few thoughts. The owner of these earrings, the private owner of these earrings, before they were donated to the Metropolitan, told me about their history of how they came to his collection. And they were discovered in Java, in Indonesia. But they seem to be clearly of Andhra workmanship. Martin Lerner connected them with the famous relief of the Chakravartin king that was made in Jagayapeta, where the Chakravarti king wears exactly the same shape of earrings. Now, it wouldn't be unusual. We know that the ships from India, from the eastern coast of India, were certainly trading with Indonesia. But there are very few things that have come from the so-called Shunga Satvahana period from Indonesia that can show connections with India. Certainly with Southeast Asia, we have many things from the period of Sri Vijaya, from the Mon, from the Dwaravati kingdoms. But the idea that there might have been these things from Southeast Asia in the 2nd century BC should not surprise us. After all, there are local inflections of the Jatakas which are only preserved which might have been active on the eastern coast of India that are now only preserved in Thai and certain other versions in Southeast Asia. So in my talk, I've tried to cover 4 basic terrains. I tried to introduce you to the sophisticated nature of the carvings of Amaravati and Nagarjuna Konda and Panigiri to try and ask, who are these people? Whose art is it that we are looking at? I then tried to show that the people that we are looking at come from a milieu that is familiar with ideas Roman as well as Gandharan, things that have been found in Afghanistan, things that come from Alexandria. I tried to get down to the domestic environment, not looking at the public statuary alone, but trying to look at what people might have used in their daily lives at that time. And here we see connections with Sri Lanka, with Southeast Asia, as well as within Andhra Pradesh, where you see people reinventing the iconography for their own purposes. She may have been Baobo, he may have been Harpokrates, but he is not Harpokrates necessarily in India. And she isn't Baobo, she is Mahadevi. And the same deity does not mean the same thing, even though it might look the same in different parts of the world. Now, understanding that difference makes us understand what do we mean by the word globalization or cosmopolitanism or transculturalism. And that's what I'm going to end with. These fantastic labels that are being bandied about in post-colonial and postmodern circles. What do these labels actually add up to being? Is it a case of syncretism? Or is the label one where we have to make binaries between two civilizations and then we can other one another? And then this othering leads to a reaction where people say, well, it's not just all Romanization. Some people came up with the word creolization, that we all speak in a kind of pidgin where we begin to adapt another's language. Then we talk about how there is a nativist response, and that becomes the reactionary historiography that is written. And then if there is a nativist response, the next band of scholarship that's going to come up is empires come and empires go, and because there are empires, there's going to be post-empire imagery. That's what colonialism and post-colonialism is founded on. Then we begin to think, are these post-colonial artists being emulative? Or are they being accommodative? What word are we going to use? Is this a case of complicities? Is this a case of transformation of frontiers? When you look at objects like this, it is evident that there is no one singular source of influence. In the ancient world, there is Ptolemaic and Roman Egypt, which we see that the Ptolemies are a complex multicultural society themselves. So one multicultural society is interacting with another multicultural society. That's something that we must always keep in mind, as were the sites of Asia Minor, the Near East, India, and Southeast Asia. Nor was the artistic influence one way from west to east, apart from the oft-quoted references to the Indian ivory at Pompeii, the discovery of Indian hard stone cameo blanks in Egypt, the association of terracottas at Memphis in Egypt with Indian examples, however contentious, the presence of Brahmi inscriptions on the ostraka or the pottery fragments from Egypt, the Brahmi inscriptions which have been found on the island of Socotra, along with the several ancient literary references to the objects traded from India, build up a case for the nature of exchange westward. There are scattered remains of objects, specifically the remains of Indian pottery, which are found more frequently at the ports of Berenike and Meos Homos, and these are traced back to South India and the East Coast, probably from the ports of Barigaza. We found terracottas and other molded wares at Petra and Aksum, which seem again to have come out of the Indian world. What I'm trying to get at is that in each of these places, these objects are adapted to a local meaning. Whereas there is no gainsaying the importance of India's trading links with Rome, art historically we are becoming aware of the need, and sometimes we're even becoming capable, of telling the differences between the interaction between India's Gandharan interaction with the Roman world or Ptolemaic world versus the Deccan's interaction with the Ptolemaic world. Just as Indian is a category that may be so diverse as to mean nothing, so too was Roman an equally diverse category. Now, we are not the only people who are culpable of making essentializations. It's not just the Western world that clubs all Indian diversity into Indian. Ancient Indians did exactly the same with Westerners. And texts call all Westerners Yavanas, irrespective of the fact whether they are Roman Yavanas or they're Egyptian ones or the original Ionian Yavanas. The Yavana rubric becomes one that becomes a bracket for anyone from the Western world. We need to understand that if an object looks like it has Greek influence, doesn't mean it's come from Greece, because the Greeks are no longer Greek. And the Greeks often live in diaspora at that time. They live in Bactria, they live in the 20 other Alexandrias that have been left in the aftermath of Alexander's invasion. Many of the Greek elite are migrating out of Greece because they are being Romanized and Latinized. You have a kingdom that comes up at this time, the Parthians, who call themselves friends of the Greeks, which gives safe haven to the Greeks. We need to keep these kinds of problems in our mind as we approach the whole subject of transculturalism and cosmopolitanism. I'm going to end, however, with a slightly different thought. It's all very well to try and come up with these deductions when one is faced with elite cultural remains and very expensive cultural remains like Buddhist stupas or Sanskrit texts. But these problems become magnified when we examine the small finds, or what are called minor antiquities. Because here, we have to question as to whose religion is it that we are really looking at? Which tradition? You're looking into people's private lives, their domestic and ephemeral lives, which seldom finds any documentation in texts, whether Latin, Greek, or Sanskrit. And yet, it lies at the bedrock of cultural expression. These cultural expressions reflect an exchange of ideas at a more personal level, and they perhaps require a very different kind of methodology for us to be able to approach this material. What are we going to do? How are we going to interpret this material? What do we know, for instance, about ancient Indian women's rituals? We saw evidence for little babies, things that are used in people's homes. See the seafaring traders who came to India. We saw the kind of talismans that people would have worn. About travelers' superstitions, about masked dances, about festivals, performances, etc. And is it anyone's case that these objects are not the true harbingers of cultural exchange? I leave that question with you as I leave you to think about what we mean by cosmopolitanism. Thank you.
While you were talking, I was thinking about inscriptions that talk about cosmopolitan interactions, the Yavana donors at Sanchi, for instance, or that wonderful pillar, again, at Besnagar, which talks about a Greek named Heliodorus and describes him as a Bhagavata, a worshipper of Vasudev Krishna. I'd like to just start by asking you about one of the issues that you raised. You pointed out that the categories of Indian and Roman actually conceal a great deal of diversity. And I wanted to ask you about the category of Andhra art. You've drawn illustrations from various sites such as Nagarjunakonda, Amaravati, Panigiri. How do you view the stylistic and thematic relationship between these sites, and do you think we can view them as representatives of a distinct Andhra style, which then interacts with other kinds of styles in other parts of the world?
I think the material that we get at different Andhra sites is slightly different. And it reveals, on closer examination, iconographically, can reveal slightly different versions of the Jatakas being told at different places. So it might look like the same scene, the Great Departure, but who was present at that Great Departure? Actually, different texts will give you slightly different versions. The Buddha Charita will mention, this list of people who were there, but you look at some other early depiction and Jataka story, and it will give you a slightly different list of who was present at that moment. And then when you look at the reliefs, you can say, this has got the 9 people, and this one has the 7 people, and maybe they are following such and such text at that monument and not the other. And that might reveal which school or sub-school of Buddhism was active at that particular site. So what I'm trying to get at is that there are certain elements of stylistic unity that seem to bind a lot of this material, but I think a very detailed and close reading of the material can actually reveal individual inflections. And certainly when we come to the so-called Andhra style, which is, spectacular beyond belief, we have to understand that it is in an era and in a period which is alongside all these other objects that we don't usually look at. So the so-called Hindu objects, the terracotta objects, these non-mainstream, non-Buddhist objects haven't actually been studied as much and been made a part of the style. So our reading of what is the Andhra style needs to be probed.
Okay, when you started your lecture, I thought you were going to compare various Buddhist sites in Andhra and with Buddhist material elsewhere. So I was glad that you brought in the other religious traditions, and you talked about, for instance, the Gudimalam Lingam. And the sites that you spoke about actually are places, many of them, where we have remains of other kinds of religious structures. For instance, Amaravati is close to the Amareshwar temple, and Nagarjunakunda, apart from the Buddhist material that has been found there in the monasteries, also has temples dedicated to Kartikeya and Vishnu and Shiv belonging to the same period. So would you like to extend what you have just said and the kind of parallels that you've been drawing across religious traditions to the Andhra region, and talk a little bit about how the interactions across these traditions takes place within Andhra?
I would like to extend, firstly, I think it's not Andhra. What we term Andhra, what we call Andhra, we include, just for everyone to know, because we art historians and historians use the Andhra word as a broader rubric. We have nothing against Telangana, and we have nothing against Maharashtra and Karnataka, which form part of this larger style. It's just that the largest majority, the overwhelming majority of sites has been in Andhra Pradesh, which is why it ends up being termed the Andhra study. I think these sites exist cheek by jowl with other sites. At Amaravati, apart from the Amareshwar temple, there is the famous Vadamanu stupa. Vadamanu is a prakritization of Vardhamanu. And Vardhaman, referring clearly to Mahavir. And the stupa there, the remains of which, there is just a basic stupa that's left on the top of the hill there, but it was excavated by the Birla Science Academy, and the sculptures from there lie in the Birla Science Academy Museum in Hyderabad. And it's baffling. There are all these scenes of abduction and things, and you begin to wonder, is this any different? But you don't specifically know what are the Jain versions of the same myth. Now the Dasharath Jatak, for instance, or the idea that the Ramayana might be a story that is shared between in the Jain version, in the Hindu version, and the Buddhist version, certainly makes it complicated. Because superficially you may be seeing the same story, but it doesn't mean that every time you see the Ramayana, it is a Hindu Ramayana. And that's what needs to be kept in mind, that the mythic base seems to borrow ideas. Perhaps one of the most famous pieces from Amaravati that lies in the British Museum is the one that shows the Buddha walking on water. The footsteps that show him crossing the Niranjan River. And you see that as a 1st century AD relief. And one immediately begins to wonder that, this business about walking on water had obviously become a very fashionable motif 2,000 odd years ago. And various religions wanted to adopt it and show it. And I think that's what we are looking at. We have to bear that in mind, because there are many complex things which are taking place. Now, having said that, I think the volume of the so-called Brahmanical Hindu reliefs from Andhra Pradesh are remarkably few and far between. And yet, when they do occur, they are so clearly formed and so complex that it immediately reveals that there must have been much more. And those temples have obviously been reused, and they must remain in constant worship. Because like with Amaravati, all of these sculptures have been recarved and recast. So perhaps with the Hindu shrines, it's more of a history of them being in constant use, which is why we don't have such a neat Hindu archaeology for that region.
It would be very unfortunate if our discussion remained India-centric, because one of the aspects that you brought out so beautifully was that we really have to look beyond subcontinental frames and look at artistic exchange beyond these boundaries. And my big takeaway from your lecture was the Yakshi found at Pompeii. I thought that was truly amazing. I just want to ask you about how you would like to explain some of those parallels, very intriguing parallels that you drew our attention to. You have talked about trade and the kinds of artifacts that were moving across different parts of the world along the trade routes. I was thinking that in relation to the kinds of artistic exchanges that we see at Buddhist sites across Asia, you really need to work out the monastic connections, the connections between monastic communities in different parts of Asia as well. After all, and Nagarjun Konda is a great example of that, because it's, you know, monks from Sri Lanka, and from, if there's even reference to monks from Chin and various other parts of India and Asia mentioned there. Would you like to say something about that?
I think the Sangha, the idea that the monks play such an important role in transporting ideas, is very important, because the monks don't just go alone. They go with an entire body of literature with them. And that encapsulates a whole worldview. So when a particular monastic order is set up in a different part of the world, they go with their entire liturgy, their mythology with them. And that opens up an entire world of mythic communication with another community of people. So more stories of Nagas and different kinds of Nagas and how they are adapted into the Buddhist pantheon, and how they were absorbed, how Yakshas and Nagas are absorbed into the Buddhist pantheon in Sangha is different from how they are absorbed into the local pantheon in Nagarjunakonda, and certainly different from what happens in Java and in Thailand. And this is exactly what we are seeing, where the myths provide a model for interaction. And we need to examine those myths as being enabling constitutions almost, that permit certain levels of interaction, because for those who believe in the myth acts as a model of interaction. And I think that's what we need to consider. I think there are other forces of exchange as well. I mean, a lot of scholars have been working, for instance, on the Roman army. These are groups which are circulating and moving from Gaul to Dacia to coming down to Alexandria, and every 6 months they're marching and they're going from place to place. Now imagine an entire group of men constantly circulating and going around the world, transporting ideas as they move. We've got traders. And we also have to think about the fact that there are royal patrons. I've personally always believed, I mean, it's a thing that I stopped this lecture with the 4th century, and I didn't really want to look at things beyond the 4th. But a very similar and an interesting thing starts happening in the 6th, 7th century, doesn't it? Another body of mythic texts get absorbed by a different set of purohits this time, rather than the Sangha. And we call these the Puranas. And they become another group of another mythic constitution that also starts spreading to Southeast Asia, enabling yet another level of mythic exchange to take place. And I think these textual traditions have to be looked at as being a kind of buttressing and scaffolding that enable a certain exchange to take place. After all, that is the great lesson that we have taken away from the cultures of the book, as to what is it that the book enables as a means of exchange. And I think we need to think about the coming of books and codification in the Indian environment and what that means for civilizational exchange as well.
We have a few minutes for questions from the audience.
I wanted to ask someone, you raised the question about the chairs in the sculpture, and then you never told us where they came from.
There are people, we have much better documentation for Greek and Roman furniture than we do for Indian. And these have become the kind of subjects which have become very unfashionable in our history, because they used to be done about 30 odd years ago, 40 years ago. People used to patiently sketch and document all the different hairstyles and jewelry styles and chair styles and things, and nobody's been doing that. And I think it's going to be rewarding to revisit some of that data, because I think we have, in many cases, more extensive and better documentation from the photographic archive now that is more easily accessible. So, whereas I think that the rounded back chair, there is some documentation of it, and with lion's paws, lion feet are more clearly documented in Greco-Roman furniture. We don't have enough examples in India, but JNU wrote a famous book about the whole motif of the idea of the Singhasan. The very word Singhasan means the asan, which is a lion. And so it is conceptually endemic to Indian thinking, yet the practical examples that we have seen don't necessarily, so we associate certain shapes. I showed those two different types of thrones. One with the legs that were clearly shaped very typically as a broader chair in the Indian style. And then you get this one with the rounded back and the lion's paws, which seems to be perhaps more Roman in style.
Hi. I actually, this whole thing of cross-culturalism made me think about, I was sitting next to a Jungian actually, and I just thought of the archetypes and what Joseph Campbell always spoke about, and the connections that you make without the actual trade physically taking place between psyches of races actually existing, perhaps not even really coming into contact, but similar human developments in consciousness occurring at different, in different sites. What would you say about that?
It's difficult terrain because it can mean anything and everything simultaneously. We want to look for very empirical, tangible, specific examples to be able to make those connections. It's not that I don't believe in them. I think they're there. I just think it's harder to prove them, always. I think in some cases there have been very fruitful interactions and ways of proving how those connections have been there in these very subliminal levels of interaction. But tracing a history for interactions at that level is a very hard call, especially for an art historian.
It's a little bit of a question as well as a comment. I mean, I really like your the point that you're making about circulation of text and textual communities and the linkages that come up as a consequence of that. And what's also very nice about that point is that different kinds of scholars at different epochs have actually studied this circulation of text. I mean, I'm thinking for the early modern, En Sing Ho, for example, will bring out this point very nicely. But that also leaves us with a little bit of a question, a problem. For example, you talked about the 6th, 7th century, and you talked about the Puranic moment into Southeast Asia. Actually, when you said 6th, 7th century, I said that was my Eureka moment because I thought you were going to talk about Arabic. Yeah. So there are, in other words, circles of these textual communities and textual exchanges that take place. So that's one thing. In other words, you keep talking about horizontal exchange as well as, I think, a vertical exchange that is taking place. Different classes of people, the quotidian that you might say, how do they respond? That's another circuit of exchange. That's one point. The second one would be of time difference. I mean, it's interesting for us to chart out a horizontal movement of ideas, but, is the 6th, 7th century, of course, as we know, is very different, say, from the 1st and 2nd century. But, in this Benedict Anderson kind of making textual communities, how resilient is it at different moments in time? In other words, what is its impact? Say, in the Roman moment, how did it affect people and spaces from the 6th and 7th centuries? What are the different types of typologies that might, it gets to be, the attempt to historicize that exchange is one that I'd be interested in.
I think that's a very fruitful line of inquiry, and it's almost coming full circle to studying, going back to subjects like Indology and studying those kinds of things, because when you go into the content of exactly what it is that the myth is promoting, or those texts are promoting, and what is the kind of interaction that is coming along, that the text is enabling, that opens up other areas of disciplinary expertise of your domain, and I'm merely looking at the kind of objects and trying to peg them to ways of which thinking how these texts can actually help us in understanding those exchanges that might be taking place. Because I think all too often the textual exchange has been bracketed. Okay, let me read a little bit. Being a scholar of somebody who was looking at the everyday and at objects of terracotta that were used by people in their homes, I was given to understand constantly that it would be irrelevant for me to study the texts. And it was after many years of discovering as to why is it that the texts are actually going to be useful for someone like me, and what is it that I can get from the texts by trying to understand what is it that the texts actually enabled for a wider civilizational interaction. And I think it isn't irrelevant to study the textual sources, even if you are trying to tell a history from below. It isn't irrelevant to look at what's happening on the top, because then you're imagining that the top isn't influenced by what's happening at the bottom. And I think it isn't the way in which we categorize our sources can create more problems for us sometimes and put us into narrow brackets which aren't always useful or really present an accurate picture of how history is lived. And I think examining the specific differences between the way in which a myth is adapted and changed and how a motif transforms, what led to that transformation, that the same myth is, a similar myth is there in the Jatak or in the Old Testament, but it is transformed into something different and it's adapted in a slightly different way in a Jatak, or it is transformed into a slightly different thing in a different text. Why does that adaptation take place in that culture? It's all very well to look at the Panchatantra and the Jatak as moving into Grimm's fairy tales via the Kalila, Vadimna, and whatever else, but there are mild differences in the way in which the story gets told. Is it merely the accident of Chinese whispers? Or is it actually a deliberate change and transformation in that story? And I think sometimes we don't give enough credit to the fact that there might be a deliberate way in which those stories might have been transformed.